All right. We're good to go. All right. Well, welcome everyone to our first webinar for 2025, and it is our State of SMSFs. My name is Aaron Dunn, and I'm joined here today by Tim Miller, our SMSF Technical and Education Manager at Smarter SMSF. Thanks, Tim.
No worries, Aaron. Always a pleasure.
Well, I guess the topic of the State of SMSFs is a good opportunity for us to have a look at what's been happening, but equally understand where we may be heading in the industry as an SMSF industry more broadly for 2025. And we know that it's an election year and all those things. But to you, Tim, I guess to start with, how did we actually think 2024 stacked up for the SMSF industry? Because we did have the Labor Party obviously looking to introduce measures around Division 296 tax. We also saw the finalisation of the NALI measures. We saw a number of regulatory changes and rulings get finalised. The ATO had some primary concerns around illegal early release. Kind of sounds a bit more doom and gloom, didn't it?
Yeah, look, it was an interesting year. I would sort of say it was a year that we had some wins and some losses. Whether they're all balance out in the end, time will tell. But we've been waiting a long time for a number of those ATO rulings to be finalised. So even though perhaps we weren't necessarily happy with what we got in the end as a final product, we've at least seen some of those rulings released, so we can now move forward on contribution concepts and pension concepts. So that's really good. Obviously, a measure from an industry point of view, whilst it doesn't impact everybody, legacy pensions to me was a big win. A big win.
Absolutely.
The NALI one was probably a loss, but how much of a loss will it be really is probably the
tinkering at the edges, probably in the end.
That's it. And then of course the Div 296 is still the uncertainty. It felt like a win at the end of the year, but a win can turn to a loss very quickly, and that very soon could come in the next week or so. So, we'll wait and see on that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's very much the case, is that we did have a year where things moved, and whilst it didn't seem like there was a lot going on, there was actually quite a bit. And I guess the reason why we wanted to raise that first is because when you actually look at the data, the data seems to be telling quite a fascinating story as to what's happening within the SMSF sector. And that is that we are seeing a real resurgence in those individuals looking to set up self-managed super funds. And we see it on our Smarter SMSF platform, just simply the volume of establishments, the changes in trustee structures, and just the fact that there is an ever-growing source of individuals that have enough superannuation, and enough superannuation has changed over time when you think about it, where self-managed super funds become attractive. So those things of choice and control have still very much rung true, but there's been a number of other things that have happened within the industry that have resonated with individuals, and therefore seen the growth sort of re-emerge in the industry.
Yeah, I think what's fascinating for me when we look at that chart there is super reform happened in 2017. And self-managed super funds really probably were at their lowest ebb as a result of that. 2018. You look at that, I think the net growth was 44 funds that year. So a lot of whilst the establishment numbers were still okay, the wind-ups were fairly significant at that point. So to see the gradual growth, to then see now record numbers in the last quarter, and it'll be fascinating to see sort of why over time, why people have sort of seen that, and we've made a few suggestions there, but without any sort of real knowledge as to the reasoning. Maybe it's a factor of all of it, maybe it's also just a factor of the whole concept of the younger demographic, which I know if we've got more graphics to show there, but the younger demographic do seem to want to have more control over everything. And maybe that's where self-managed super funds have a part to play.
Yeah, and you can look at this with that younger demographic to go, well, those in that 35 to 44 cohort, which is the largest profile of establishments, and historically the largest cohort was in that 45 to 54 bracket, is that group have had compulsory super since their day one of employment life.
Yeah.
So naturally they're going to have account balances if they've gone into a self-managed fund with a partner or so forth, that there is now greater scope for them to be able to look at a self-managed fund much earlier. We've naturally seen the pricing points to be able to run those funds change quite substantially through the impact of technology, and therefore that net establishment growth, and I think we've indicated here as well that the September quarter was over 10,000, which is the largest quarterly number that we've seen going back to 2007.
Yeah, and I think one of those points that you raised there about about these people being in the super guarantee generation and having compulsory super, not only that, but a lot of them, particularly those at that say the 38 age group, they have had a higher percentage. So they weren't in super when it was 2 and 3%, based on employment issues that back there. They sort of came in at the 8-9% of super. So they sort of hit the ground running in that regard, and have had a bit of a base to build on, and they're looking at what other opportunities present.
Yeah, and this is where, for you as professionals, it becomes really important to understand what those trends are looking like. We do see in the marketplace those that are interested in a self-managed fund, and maybe it's looking at property-related transactions. Some might be looking at crypto-related transactions, and not to say that it's 100% into these or whatever, but there is certainly different types of investment profiles that people are looking at today that the traditional self-managed super fund investor of 15 and 20 years ago would not have been looking at.
Yeah, 100%. 100%.
And the final thing there is just the, I guess, how far dispersed by way of age demographic we now have. We've got clients, and we'll talk about legacy pensions a little bit more shortly. Clients now with SMSFs in their mid-80s and 90s, but we also now are seeing, again, that much younger cohort, down into their late 20s, early 30s even. And understanding the difference in that profile of your clients becomes really important to understand the types of services ultimately that you'll be able to provide to support them.
Yeah, and look, it's as a couple of young bucks that we are, Aaron, yes. We both sort of started our SMSF journey when a lot of these clients were in their mid to late 50s, early 60s. Yep. And so, the group that we've spent a lot of our time with are that group who are now, nearing the end of life more so than the beginning. And so it is sort of fascinating to watch how new generations tend to look at things from an investment point of view, and how self-managed super funds can help them. So, for me, it's certainly a growth journey, a secondary growth journey. So we've taken one group through that, what was preservation age, through to effectively death.
Yep.
In that sense, and now there's a lot more focus on accumulation elements there, and that transition to retirement phase, as we continue to evolve as an industry.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, the other part here that is certainly not the elephant in the room, but we are definitely waiting around to the timing of this, is quite clearly an election is going to play a crucial role in what happens with the SMSF industry. And it's worth noting that superannuation reform wasn't to occur under Labor's first term of government. So they were predominantly focused on other areas, and we know quite clearly, tax, sort of the tax changes and some of those other areas around wage growth and those things. And whilst they kind of didn't stay fully true to that word, the reality around superannuation reform is probably therefore going to come if they end up with a second term. Now, superannuation policy here, when we look at the settings that we know so far, are very different in the context of what the Labor Party has looked to introduce. And so far, we've seen things like the superannuation objective get finalised late last year, and understanding maybe what role that could play. And again, we'll talk about that shortly. versus the coalition, who quite clearly have put their stake in the ground around the fact that housing will play a role. So being able to use superannuation for housing. They've also made reference to the fact that 12% is too high, and potentially they would like to see some type of flexibility from 9% and above to, in essence, have some function of redraw for certain purposes in life, and looking at supporting those that go through domestic violence and marital breakdown and those sorts of things. And again, we'll get more meat on the bone in respect to these issues as we formally move into an election phase. But superannuation to me is going to sit front and centre once again when it comes to this upcoming election period. And I guess, Tim, the other part that I'm fascinated in here is this issue of Division 296, because this time last year, when we were talking about it, we were really pushing people to the fact of get ready.
Yep.
This is coming in. This is what we need to start being prepared for with our clients, but wait until it becomes law.
Yeah, and it's been a long wait, and we're obviously still waiting. And I think this is one of the key issues. And we go back, this whole concept of Div 296 was really sort of, I guess it was the cat amongst the pigeons at 2022. Yep. This time 2022, when everyone was talking about the government were going to target those with high super balances, and there's all sorts of numbers thrown around, yep. 5 million, all sorts of other things. But this concept of taking money out of super, not being able to retain it in super, and that I think made the government, who I don't think they were quite ready to launch it at that point in time, but they went early.
They were forced to. Yeah, ultimately, their hand was forced.
And so it got to the position, and I mean, they've been steadfast. And we saw some press around this last week around that they've been strong in the consultation. And so people have then somewhat asked them to define what consultation means, because yep. it seems more that consultation is dictation.
Yes. And you were a part of it.
I was,
absolutely.
Indeed.
So and so we could tell you firsthand exactly how that consultation worked around SMSFs in particular.
And so it's interesting, and we'll talk a little bit about that Div 296 in a moment, but it's interesting to know that, it's not dead and buried completely. It's clearly still a focus of theirs, and they've made mention as such that it's still their priority to get that over the line. Versus, as you say before, the whole Labor versus coalition thing. The coalition has said that they would repeal it. Now, of course, if it's not in, there's nothing to repeal. It just means it doesn't go ahead if there's no passage pre-election time. Yeah. So, it is a big issue, because, and when we go back to the concept before of the growth, and the growth being in that 38 to 45 bracket or whatever, those members in superannuation more broadly, they're not going to be impacted by this measure. So this measure is, and has been often referred to as, a bit of a legacy item. And a lot of those members, and whilst yes, there are younger members that have significant balances, it's about, was this pushed through for a short-term gain? And of course, we also know that a lot of the numbers that the government put in their budget were based on generating some revenue from this. So how it progresses over the next coming weeks is going to be interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the other areas of uncertainty certainly sit around the outcomes of what was the QAR measures, which are now brought into the delivering better financial outcomes. And there's a lot of work that's being done in this space still, but there is some concern around, from an SMSF, so sort of taking an inward look here of the role of which advisors will be able to help meet the needs of SMSF members. So there is some very specific exclusions in this sort of new advisor role that is being looked at to be able to support industry funds and retail funds, and a specific carve out for them to be able to talk about SMSFs. But it doesn't really address the need to support those. And there has been a lot of discussion, and will continue to be a lot of discussion about the role that potentially accountants could play in this space to be able to support their clients, who are naturally the ones that see these SMSF members at the coalface. And the final one here is, again, something that's been sort of floating around for some time, and that is their government's focus on retirement. And it is predominantly looking at APRA-regulated funds, but I think SMSFs certainly aren't immune from what we need to consider as baby boomers have entered and continue to enter the retirement phase space. So Tim, let's sort of jump on to this Div 296 and really help people to understand, because we thought it was dead.
Yeah.
We thought it was at least dead unless Labor were to be re-elected. We got a bill that was finally passed in the House of Reps on the 9th of October. Through the guillotine motion, they tried to have this measure put through the guillotine, were unsuccessful. But what did fall out of the back of that was a motion that was passed that said the next sitting day, you as the Senate need to make a decision on this bill.
Yeah. And what's convenient, other than for our timing here today, is that sitting day is next week.
Yep.
So we're going to know, and unless an election is called between now and next, what's that, Tuesday, Wednesday, whatever the day is, unless an election is called in that time frame, which we doubt, but you never know, then it's going to at least be discussed. And so, we're going to at least head towards an election knowing whether Division 296 is a thing or not.
Yeah, and the important thing to note here, and the reason why we put that Senate sort of breakdown there is that the Labor Party needs 39 A's or yeses in essence, and the reality is that we have 9 crossbench senators that at this point in time are uniformly together to ensure that this legislation in its current form does not get through.
Yeah.
Now, that does not mean that there may be some work that's being done in the background for this decision on the 4th of February. But as we understand at this point in time, based upon the current form of that bill, Labor would not have the numbers. So if it goes to the vote on the 4th, that the 39 A's that they need, they would not achieve that outcome.
Yeah, and I think to be clear on some of the key issues here is that primarily the biggest thing that is creating the most angst is the unrealised capital gains side of things and the taxation there, and the lack of indexation for the cap. They're the primary issues with the legislation, because there's actually some not hidden elements within the legislation, but some quite positive issues within the legislation that, I think from an industry point of view, we would see great value in their passage. And one of those is this concept of total superannuation balance from a valuation point of view. And what we see right now is quite a clunky approach to calculating total superannuation balance, because it's got this kind of hokey pokey approach to it. Like you put your transfer balance cap in, you take your transfer balance cap out, and then you add your valuations and you shake it all about type thing. But the reality is that ultimately results in the same end position as what this new, much cleaner outcome definition of total super balance, which is you have your accumulation value and your retirement phase value based on the value at 30 June were you to exit the fund. And so it's just cleaner, and it separates total super balance from the concept of transfer balance cap for many purposes. And of course, a couple of the other things that they reference in there was that there'll be valuation requirements for defined benefit interests, which again also ties in quite nicely to the legacy pension concept that we'll discuss a little bit later.
Correct.
So for us to get to a position where we actually get into a end result of having this determination for total super balance would be quite a positive measure. Now, of course, it's a piece of legislation that can be changed in its own right at any point anyhow, but it's certainly something that was addressed via Div 296, certainly made it cleaner, and would be certainly something I think from an industry point of view we would want to administratively push towards,
continue to pursue,
if Div 296 is not to continue in any way, shape or form.
So we touched on before about this superannuation policy framework and the coalition versus what Labor might be doing. And to me, one of the things that we did see through that guillotine measure was the fact that the superannuation objective bill became an act. Ultimately, now this is enshrined in legislation where the objective is to preserve savings, to deliver income for a dignified retirement, alongside government support in an equitable and sustainable way. And each of those elements have their own definition. And ultimately, though, when we look at what the objective is meant to do, well, it's really a measurement of future policy changes to judge against what this objective does. So when we have a piece of legislation, we have a statement of compatibility for human rights and for other things that ultimately means that the statement of compatibility must also look at this new piece of superannuation policy. It doesn't have any enforceability. So that means that if something wants to go through that may be against the framework that we have within this objective, there's nothing really that happens from a policy point of view, from a regulatory standpoint, that it would change the fact that if a side of government has control of the House and the Senate, that they couldn't simply go through and make those changes. So this is why when I talked earlier about the policy differences, I can see Labor very much using this objective framework to talk about the fact that housing is not there for the purposes of preservation, that the changes that they want to make are not going to deliver income in retirement. I'd be interested in your views on that.
Yeah, I guess it's an interesting one. And where I look at it too is that, and often when I'm trying to explain why there is an objective, I look at it and say, well, trustees have a sole purpose, right? Yep. And that purpose is to provide benefits in retirement, right? That's a very broad brush approach, okay? But is to provide benefits to the members in retirement or to their beneficiaries if the members don't make it to retirement, right? So that's what all super funds are in existence for. What the objective is almost to introduce a sole purpose for government and say, right, well, this is what the purpose of super is for, is to provide benefits in retirement. So yeah, when we look at things like housing, but then it makes me also start to question some of these other conditions of release, and we see like compassionate grounds, financial hardship, which have been enshrined in our regulations for a long time now under conditions of release, but they've changed, right? There's been changes to those conditions over time. We saw obviously, and I think a factor of this objective was the COVID-19 early release and the fact that people could access super during COVID for that short-term purpose, and that put a lot of pressure on the super industry and liquidity for some of the non-SMSF funds out there as well. And so, you know, I think it hopefully gives that scope for the government of the day to be able to say, okay, well, you know, should this or how does this change impact how much people are going to have in retirement, and you know, and is it really worth pursuing?
Yeah, and I think a lot of it just comes down to that political, the political views on how much control different parts of the superannuation industry they want to actually have. So, so this objective will be quite interesting to see how it plays out in the coming months.
Yeah.
So inflation, wages, all things that have been top of mind for some period of time here in Australia, and quite clearly, Tim, these are areas that continue to have an impact on superannuation, and this is an area where we literally have some information that's come out today that I'll get you to work through.
Yeah, so inflation and wages are the two words we use from a title point of view. In old school super talk, we're talking about AWOTI and CPI, sort of our two wonderful factors, because nothing is ever indexed the same in the superannuation system. We have a lot of old processes that are still indexed to average weekly ordinary times earnings, and one of those is our contribution caps, right? And so there's a formula. You can see the formula there, and every year we get excited. Those of us in the technical space, we get a bit excited by working out what factor do we need to hit to get indexation of the caps. And you can see there, for us to get indexation of the caps, we just had it last July. We need to hit a factor of 1993.5, and the last factor we released was 192340. So you can pretty much guarantee that we're not seeing a contribution cap indexation at this year.
Even though we've seen wages growth, the wages growth isn't strong enough to really push us to that level.
That's right, and it may very well be that we don't even see that until say 2027, with the disparity in that number there, and it might even be, who knows. But we'll know for sure on the 20th of February. The alternative calculation is the CPI-based calculation, which is what is utilised for our transfer balance cap, our general transfer balance cap, which is indexed by $100,000 increments, right, subject to that CPI factor. Now, that CPI factor is and was released on the 29th of January, which happens to be today, and that was the mad scramble just prior to us getting online to ensure that this slide was up to date. We needed a number of 137.5. We got 139.4. We already knew it was likely because September, the September quarter was 139.1, so or thereabouts. So we had already sort of speculated that indexation from $1.9 to $2 million will occur from the 1st of July 2025. So legislatively, that will occur. The only thing that might change it is an election and an announcement by a government. But that $2 million is the expected legislative result from the 1st of July. If people are keen on 22.1 million, I wouldn't hold your breath there because we need to get to 144.4. And we're clearly not there today. Right. So whether we're there next year for another cap increase, we'll have to wait and see. And again, the numbers sort of indicate that it'll be touch and go to get that again. It tends to be on a 2-year sort of cycle. And the crazy sort of inflation numbers that we saw a couple of years ago, we've dropped back a little bit from there. So we won't see 2.1. We will see 2 million unless there is some form of announcement by the government, which we're not expecting to see. But yeah, so that's a key issue there. And I know, Aaron, that you wanted to make that additional comment there in regards to the Greens.
Yeah, so one of the interesting things that we saw around the Div 296 measures was, through the Senate inquiry, was the Greens have really put a stake in the ground from their policy standpoint to not only introduce the Division 296 tax measures, so sitting on the side of the Labor Party, but they would like to see that threshold reduced even further to $2 million, which is in essence the transfer balance cap when we think about it for 1 July 25. So these measures would be coming in, and if you have a person that has taken themselves to their transfer balance cap limit, they would also be at the floor of what is the introduction of those Division 296 tax measures. So just something to be conscious of there around the different views and policy settings that these different parties have.
Yeah, that's right. And look, just one point on that, it would be that, the fund, you might start your pension with your $2 million, for example, and that might be all you have. And so the fund would still be generating exempt income, but you as an individual would be levied with this additional personal tax liability.
Yeah, correct.
And so, of course, just to bring that sort of commentary to a close, what it means is we see an increase in the total super balance threshold. So we're not seeing an increase in the non-concessional cap threshold, but an increase in the total super balance threshold for the ability to make contributions. And so how that would factor out is somebody, for example, and if we jump into the next slide there, we can use this example here of a member who back in 2023, they had a total super balance of 1.67. At that point in time, they could use the full bring forward amount. And so they wanted to bring forward 330, but they only made it 150. So they triggered it in that year. Meant that they gave themselves 180 that they could contribute over the next couple of years. But their balance for the contributions and some growth took them over 1.9, which meant they were ineligible to contribute in this current year, the 24-25 year. But if their balance at the end of this financial year jumps to 1.95 and the general transfer balance cap has jumped to 2 million, it means it opens them up to be able to utilise in that third year the remaining balance of that bring forward. So they'd be able to contribute that 180,000 in the final year, having triggered it in year one. Noting that, of course, they're not entitled to indexation that occurred last year because they'd already triggered the 3-year bring forward. So it's, a growth in the general transfer balance cap that's not aligned with non-concessional growth can often be beneficial for those around that around the peripherals of the cap from a contribution point of view.
Yeah, benefit, and I equally think it can become somewhat problematic for people too. So understanding the differences between inflation-based adjustments, as we've seen with the transfer balance cap, versus wages or WATI-based adjustments, and we were very deliberate in this example to show you that in year one we were going back to an old NCC cap linked to a lower value that then subsequently increased on the 1st of July 24, but then we had a balance that knocked people out because of the transfer balance cap, and then we get an indexation of the transfer balance cap, but not the NCC cap. So just understanding all those different nuances that sit in between, because if you get it wrong, the penalties can be quite significant.
Absolutely.
So the other thing then, when we think about inflationary effect, is around our limited recourse borrowing. And we did see in May of last year, the fact that the standard lending rate under our safe harbour provisions went from 8.85% to 9.35%. And the view at that time was very much, well, you're kind of stuck with a interest rate for the next 12 months, when we were expecting that rate to probably taper off. But the reality is that rate has not tapered off as yet, and we are about to hit February 2025.
Yeah, and this is the thing, is that the fact that we're about to hit February 2025 means we're only a few months away, and I can't believe it's about to be February already, but we're only a couple of months away from May, right? And May is when, again, we'll look at the lending rate. And if we don't see a significant dip in that lending rate from that 9.35, then we're going to see this 9.35 locked in for another 12 months from a related party LRBA arrangement under the PCG. So, you know, it's really that time now we're saying, okay, well, if we didn't jump last year, so if you had a limited recourse borrowing arrangement and you had related party lending in place, and you maintained it at that 9.35, you know, are we comfortable, given that we've given up trying to forecast if the rates are going up or down or down or whatever at any point in time soon? Is now the time to look at trying to exit these things? Because, you know, with the current lending arrangements out there, we can generally get around that 7% mark. You know, would we see that PCG rate drop that significantly? So that's one of the, I guess, the key questions.
Yeah, and the other fascinating thing here is for some of these arrangements that started from 2010 and maybe even earlier potentially, noting that the laws did go back to September 07, we are getting very close to what is that 15-year safe harbour as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's so many things to factor in.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, as naturally as part of the topics that we're talking about today, we will be deep diving into many of these in our upcoming SMSF Day events that we are hosting from the 20th of March through to the 2nd of April 2025. So, Tim, I'm looking forward to sort of getting on the road again and going through. We had some fantastic attendance numbers last year. I hopefully don't need to go to get to Perth from Adelaide. I have to go via Sydney this time, but we have made a very deliberate change to the program around that. But if you want to have a very interactive day to learn from peers, look at activities that we put together through our case study, there's a great opportunity for you to join us at our upcoming SMSF Day events. And we'll be sharing a little bit more with you at the end of today's session. That includes a special offer to sign up as a webinar attendee today. So a little bit more on that shortly, but just wanted to plant that seed in your mind if you are looking at updating your CPD as we go around the country throughout the back half of March and the first couple of days of April. So let's now move on to our continued focus on retirement. And this is something that the government has really started to turn their attention to. And this goes back to 2023. And the paper really spoke about the roles that we would see that would, the retirement covenant could play within SMSFs, and we've kind of seen that before, but nothing really transpired from it. And then more recently, the government through Treasury released a fact sheet about improving the retirement phase of superannuation and really raising the bar for superannuation, noting that the retirement income covenant and the work that ASIC had done within APRA regulated funds really wasn't up to par. And it should be noted as well that only in the past 24 hours, we've seen the federal government also look to introduce a number of standards into these APRA regulated funds around things like, timing of dealing with death benefits and all of these areas that are somewhat new to APRA funds when you compare to SMSFs. So whilst there's no real specific stuff in this retirement work that has been done by the government and Treasury around SMSFs, it did highlight the role that tools could play in this area about longevity and about the different products that we have. But from a self-managed super fund perspective, just because the government didn't talk about this stuff didn't mean that we didn't have some stuff impacting the SMSF sector regarding pensions and retirement phase from the last financial year or last calendar year.
Yeah, and look, that's the thing. I think that we were all over the retirement phase superannuation paper when it was released.
Yeah,
and look, to be honest, the first time I knew that the fact sheet was released was 2 days ago when I found it online, and it was released in November. So it came with very little fanfare. Because it wasn't really an exciting release, let's be honest. It was forecasting what they might do from 26 and 27 onwards. So there was some sort of minor consequences there for the industry. But the reality for self-managed super funds was we saw 2 very significant events occur in 2024 that I think will have a reasonably significant part to play and impact on self-managed super funds in 2025 and beyond. The first one was the update to TR 2013-5, so when a pension commences and ceases, predominantly around failing the minimum pension standards, and we'll touch on that in a moment there. And then the other one was the legacy pension commutation capacity and the changes in allocations from SMSF reserves or from fund reserves, and this was a long-standing item that we weren't necessarily expecting. We had great engagement with Treasury, so it was total opposite to Div 296. Great engagement with Treasury in regards to these measures. Didn't get a lot of the things through that we would have liked in addition to what came through, but the measures themselves stand alone to provide us with enough to move forward. So, to run through those couple of measures for you all, I guess the key thing really is to have a bit of an understanding of failing the pension standards. Now, if you go back and read the rules, basically it says if you fail the pension standards at any time ever since they came in, then your pension should have ceased. Right? However, in a practical sense, it's never really been applied that way. It's only really been since the introduction of the transfer balance cap has this really sort of taken any sort of forward momentum in regards to what it means to not pay the pension, because a lot of people now have pension and accumulation interest and other things merged together. But realistically, what it's ended with, because the tax office had previously in their first draft of this ruling, had basically sort of come out with their position where the pension would cease, right, but you would then need to recommence the pension from the 1st of July. That was the concept of failing to pay the minimum and how we understood it.
So tax ruling dealt with tax issues, didn't deal with CIS and trust law issues, which ultimately they've tried to address through this revised ruling.
That's right. It's often the case that the tax office will address a singular issue, and their issue was you lose your tax exemption when the pension ceases. So we've got that. So if you failed to pay the pension, then the pension would cease for tax purposes back on the 1st of July. Right. What they're actually now saying is that once you fail it, then that pension has failed both CIS and tax on the 1st of July. from a transfer balance cap point of view, you actually have a debit arrangement that occurs when you fail to meet the pension standards, and you fail to meet the pension standards on the 30th of June. So you have a debit transaction occurring with the valuation of the pension on the 30th of June. But the ATO's position is primarily that from now on, right, that new pension doesn't commence until you consciously commute the first pension. So until the member actually advises themselves as a trustee to stop that pension, which cannot be before the 1st of July. And to be honest, if it's the 1st of July, then you renew on the 30th of June and you should have paid the pension. So it's realistically, you failed to pay the minimum, you're then preparing the accounts or whatever the case might be, and you go, actually, we haven't paid the minimum. What is the date of that? And this example here, we've got the 1st of March. So what we're actually saying is you're not going to get any ECPI up until that time where you make the decision to commute and potentially restart the new pension.
Yeah, so the important bit here to note is that the ATO have now said that once that pension has failed, whilst you may have a contractual arrangement in place under the terms of the deed and the pension rules, the fact that you have failed to meet a pension, the minimum standard, it means that for no future years will that pension ever be eligible to claim ECPI. So the only way you will be able to claim ECPI in respect to that income stream, i.e. put it back into the retirement phase, is to formally stop that pension and start that pension again. And that's really what that time frame is looking to highlight there, because it's simply not a 12-month time period now, as you were indicating a second ago, because the decision, the conscious decision, is happening at a much later date, which in theory is going to be the point in time in which the financial statements or the reconciliation is done around the minimum pension obligation for that year.
Yeah, and I guess another key thing too is in the example that we've provided there, the minimum was 60,000 and they've only paid 48,000. So we've then got this other layer to this, and that is that you can apply your own powers of administration. And that is if there's a pension shortfall of less than 1/12, right, then the pension can continue as long as you pay that as soon as possible after the 1st of July. But if you don't meet that 1/12 or you've failed twice to meet the minimum, then the only way you can do it is to actually go to the tax office and ask for discretion, right, to allow the pension to continue. Now, that's going to extend your definition of your ability to make a conscious decision to commute, because you can't consciously commute something if you're waiting for the commissioner to say it might be okay to keep it. So all those sorts of things do have an issue and have a piece to play in this whole process. Which for us, one of the key things is what it actually means, and there's areas that haven't been addressed necessarily by the tax office. Individuals will have addressed that in their own practices, right? But it'll be, from a practical sense, there's a lot of things that people need to be mindful of, and that is that concept of a separate superannuation interest. Because if you've been operating under the guise that it is a separate pension, then that money is accumulating in a separate interest, right? And at the fixed tax-free and taxable componentry from the commencement. But in theory, that should stop back on the 1st of July 2020, whatever year you fail. So there's a timing issue there from a componentry point of view and accumulation versus pension interest there. You've got your T-bar reporting that has to be done for that debit. Now, when is that being done? If you don't find out until later in the year from a timing point that you've missed it, then have you also missed the reporting deadlines with regards to T-bar? But then there's that change in valuation. So we've said there March is a new commencement date. Well, you've then got a valuation issue. So you might not be able to put all your money back into that pension that you had originally in it. So you might have to put more money back into the accumulation. And that's not even to contemplate things such as age pension and Commonwealth Seniors Health Card. So there's multiple issues to factor into with regards to that failing the minimum.
Yeah, so a couple of things here. So the first is we've got a number of questions that's come up here, and we knew this was going to be an area that would blow up,
Yep.
Which is why this area itself is going to be so important around our SMSF Day events. So to be looking at and drilling down and understanding it. One of the other things that we've done at Smarter SMSF is we have built through our pension rollback documentation for account-based pensions and also for TRISs, an option to select documents around the fact that the client has failed the pension standards. So this is something that you're not going to see in your SMSF software. It's not a standard commutation, right? So you actually have a set of rules that need to occur based upon the ATO's revised view and what the terms and conditions of that pension were originally. So it's worth noting those couple of things because a TRIS, for example, all of the ATO's literature on their website was updated simultaneously with the finalisation of this ruling. So a failure of a TRIS here is not only an issue in respect to the timing of when that occurs and so on and so forth. Yeah, it doesn't have T-bar, but you then come into illegal early access and the fact that the pension is not pension, it's not lump sum, but it's rather other ordinary income with no available offsets and stuff available attached to it.
Yeah. So all these sorts of things are just big issues to play. And I know we do have some questions, and we're going to come back.
We'll come back. I think we'll answer those at the end.
And answer those questions. So then the other side of things is the legacy pensions and these regulations that were released in September, right? And then were finalised finalised and registered on the lodged on the 6th, come into effect on the 7th of December. And these regulations really provide us with, from a summary point of view, the capacity for any of our clients that have market-linked pensions, lifetime compliant pensions, and any fixed-term compliant pensions that still might be remaining. You've got the ability to commute those pensions. So you currently don't have the ability to stop them. You will now have, from that date, the ability to stop the pension. When you stop it, it comes with its own obligations, like minimum pro rata requirements for the market-linked pension and other things to contemplate there. But this is a time-based regulation, so it's a 5-year regulation. There was discussion when this was originally announced a couple of years ago that there'd be a tax impost on that commutation and allocation back to the member. That's not the case. Basically, this money can stop being in these pensions and it can be used to start a new account-based pension subject to transfer balance cap. It can be left in accumulation or it can be taken out of the superannuation fund. And given that all these clients are likely to be in their 80s, it's going to come out tax-free. So it's a pretty significant measure with regards to these legacy pensions and one that people need to be mindful of. In addition to being able to stop these pensions, any associated reserves with these pensions and any alternate reserves that you might have in the superannuation fund can also be impacted by these regulatory changes. And that is that if your reserve, so if you had a fixed term pension that has ceased because the term had expired, if you've got a reserve that was linked to one of these defined benefit pensions, you can allocate to the member tax-free, right? As long as it is the original member or the beneficiary if it's a reversionary pension there. If you don't satisfy that requirement, then all other reserve allocations, which are currently subject to a 5% fair and reasonable 5% allocation rule where they're measured against the concessional contribution cap, they will now be measured, or they are now measured against the non-concessional cap. So they make for a far greater capacity to allocate monies to other members of the fund and clear out those legacy style reserves that might have been in place. So these two measures were really significant in regards to the introduction of these regulations. Now, we've been doing a fair bit of work on this, Aaron. We know that there's things that people need to be mindful of. One thing that we're waiting on, I want to highlight probably the most important point there is Social Security. If we know the government have said that from a Social Security point of view, that there will be announcements from Social Security to waive any debts associated with losing asset test exemption. So they will, obviously, if you stop, then you lose your asset test exemption, but there's been no waiver yet. So we wouldn't be acting anything on Social Security right now. But there's going to be other elements impacted. So total super balance, how's that going to change with allocations from reserves and things being made?
Yeah, so we've obviously got a webinar coming up. So there's actually a lot to unpack with this and you can see we just sort of indicated a few of those different areas there that need to be considered. Again, worth noting that over the January period, Tim and I have done a lot of work around documentation. So we've built a market-linked pension commutation document. We've also built a number of calculators and fact sheets to be able to support those. So if you do have clients that are impacted by these or you want to find out more, you can register for our upcoming legacy pensions session as well. So Tim, let's keep moving and look at what else will shape SMSFs in 2025. And I think touched on the first one here. I think we will certainly see ongoing discussions around the way in which advice will be able to be provided and the fact that we still do have this gap in the way in which SMSF clients seek that advice. I note I actually really didn't change this bit from what we had last year, which just goes to show there is a real gap in terms of this support. And the Australian Law Reform Commission, in a report not that long ago, point in time. Quite clearly, we're going to see the ATO in their regulatory approach continue to look at finalising and updating rulings where relevant. We know both NALI and the contribution one is the updated, revised one for comment before finalisation.
Yeah, and I think for both of those, the commentary period closed last week for both the NALI and the contributions rulings that were released, so LCR 2021-2 and TR 2010-1.
Yep.
And so they will have an impact on the SMSF industry, particularly the NALI one, but also maybe with some of our practices around contributions. So they're both pretty key documents, and so to see where the ATO land, if they change or not, will be a significant point there.
Yep. The tightening, I think there's a view with the superannuation objective that the Labor Party would look to tighten rules around compassionate grounds. I know there is some concerns around, the people accessing money for, lap band surgeries and other things that really, do they sort of fall outside the scope of what the intent of that law was initially? One of my bugbears is the fact that we've got most other things around electronic execution resolved other than the SIS Act, which certainly doesn't help SMSFs being able to utilise electronic execution in fullness like you can do within the Corporations Act and the Income Tax Assessment Act. We did see the legacy pension regulations get finalised, Tim, at the same time in the 2021-2022 budget. There were also measures to be introduced around loosening up or making the central management control and active member test far more flexible for SMSFs. But at this point in time, we still wait and see.
Yeah, and that's probably one of my bugbears. I'd like to see, that one's been hanging around longer. I don't like to sort of go back too far in the past, but I actually put that into a proposal in 2007. Yeah. And the government report at the time, I can't remember what it was called, it's that long ago, suggested it back in 2007. So 18 years later, it'd be nice to see that one finally brought to a close.
Yeah, and we talk about death and taxes a lot. The only thing that we can be absolutely sure of is there will be lots more case law around things like death benefit disputes. We see a growing number of private rulings around the timing of getting benefits out of superannuation, whether it's a member and death benefit. So all of those sort of things are certainly going to play their role throughout 2025 as well. And that takes us to, I guess, the one poll that we want to be asking you today as well is, what do you think will be the biggest topic that will shape the SMSF sector in 2025? So we've got a number of things there for you to think about. Interestingly, last year we had Division 296 tax, and 66% of respondents said that will be the biggest issue for the year. Well, this year we've got it in two different ways. We've got Div 296 tax goes ahead, but Div 296 tax does not go ahead. So we want to hear from you. We'll leave this open for another 20 seconds or so to get your feedback on what you think will be the biggest topic that will shape the SMSF sector in 2025. So
it's still popular.
Yeah, it's growth in establishments, the federal election. If it goes ahead, Div 296. If it does not go ahead, the focus on retirement phase, the advice reforms, or even you think all the above. So if it's all the above, we're going to be very, very busy in 2025.
Well, that's right. And I think one of the key things is the Div 296, if it does go ahead, and if it goes ahead from the 1st of July 2025, then there's a lot of work to be done in a very, very short time frame. And I'm not sure that the regulators are ready for that.
Yes.
So it'll be interesting to know whether it does go ahead from that date or whether there is a deferral if it does indeed go ahead. So.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Well, I'm going to leave this on for another 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. So I'm going to end the poll there. We'll quickly share the results for everyone. So we have about 35% saying if it goes ahead, but equally 15% if it doesn't. So,
so at least half people still think it is the most significant issue this year.
If it goes ahead, absolutely that would be the case. All right. Well, let's sort of finish this off. So what I will say is our SMSF Day agenda today, we are also formally releasing this for people to be able to find out more. So we do now have 4 sessions that we have available and set up as part of our SMSF Day events. So you will see that up on the site now. In terms of our technical update, we will be looking at the topic of contributions. It's been a couple of years since we've looked at that at the SMSF Days. We're also going to be deep diving into some various SMSF tax issues and opportunities that we see there across contributions and retirement phase and the like. And then we'll be diving into our pensions frontier, and a lot of the questions that we got today sit in this space and the end of the line as well. So that provides us with 8 CPD hours for the day. People come to this day with some homework, it's fair to say. We've got our case study. We are introducing a new case study this year and a number of activities for you to learn and grow your SMSF knowledge off the back of attending those events. From a ticket sale point of view, tickets have been going strong. We did have a super early bird prior to Christmas. So our Perth and Melbourne events are selling fast. I will note that we do have restrictions in numbers at the various locations for obvious reasons. And our SMSF Day events are only face-to-face events. We don't do this as a online event. We do our SMSF masterclasses throughout the year as part of our CPD subscriptions, where we look at specialist topics and use case studies to deliver that. Now, for you as having attended our SMSF, our State of SMSF webinar today, we do currently have our early bird ticket pricing offer at $462. Now, if you wish to come along, you can use the State SD25. This is only available for the next 3 days. So this afternoon, Thursday and Friday only. It will then reduce that ticket down to $429. For our members, those of you that are a CPD or document member and the like, we do have our CPD or document member pricing of $396, and you can use that at any point in time. But we do note that naturally your ability to use that will be subject to capacity at those relevant venues. So the benefits naturally of being a member is the fact that we do have member-specific pricing. But for those of you that just wish to come along and you were a part of today's session, we do say a special thank you and want to give you the opportunity to take advantage of this webinar offer as well. So as we wrap up, a few things to take away. So as an industry, we continue to see change on the legislative front, on the regulatory front, and on the policy front. Okay, we have an election coming up. There's a lot to still play out, and we know, therefore, that keeping yourself up to date, your team up to date, can be a challenge. And that's why we have things like our SMSF days, we have our CPD subscriptions to be able to support you. I think the reality, Tim, here is that the SMSF sector is still in reasonably good shape.
Yep.
The fact that there is growing demand for SMSFs, which means that growth in demand means that trustees need that ongoing knowledge and support right across the full spectrum of that life cycle. So for you as a professional, there is a great opportunity to still tap into what is a continuing growth story of the SMSF industry.
Absolutely.
All right, well, that pretty much takes us to the end of today. So a couple of post-event things for you to know. So a copy of the slides are going to be sent to you after today's session. There'll be an email sent to you shortly, which will include that survey link that you can see there. We have an award. We have a reward for those that complete the survey for us and provide us with some valuable feedback, not only about today, but about some of the other areas that we're trying to understand more about professionals working in the industry. We will be making the recording available to everyone over the next 24 hours for our CPD members. It will be uploaded into the learning platform in the next couple of days. That will also include the ability to complete CPD assessment for those members that haven't been able to access today. Certificates, they'll be sent out for our members over the next few days. You'll be awarded the 1 hour for that. And for everyone else, you can then obviously capture this as part of your unstructured hours. And therefore, we encourage you to think about becoming a CPD member. And we have the best part of 25 plus hours this year of accredited continuing professional development available to you. That takes us to the end. So a very big thank you, Tim, for being a part of today's session. We do have a number of upcoming events there for you that qualify as CPD. Our legacy pensions conversion, as we said, we have our Smarter SMSF update as to what's been happening from a projects point of view, recent training, recent documents, and much more. We then have our understanding deed variations session, and then of course our changing face of SMSF. And you can find out more about all of that by going to our website, smartersmsf.com/events. So Tim, that pretty much takes us to the end of today. I recognize that people, we are now just over time. So if they need to go, feel free. We will be answering the questions that we have on here now for you. So if you want to hang around, feel free to do so. But for those of you that have to leave, a very big thank you for joining us for today's State of SMSF. Have a great rest of the week. Take care and bye for now.
See you all.